Next Monday, Ireland slips further down the bottomless chasm of bondage and fascism with the introduction of yet more ridiculous COVID-19 measures and an extension of the equally nonsensical commercial restrictions. Last week, a homeless person died on our streets every day. A pedophile apologist is our Minister for Children. Ireland is expected, once again, to almost entirely shoulder the financial burden of Europe's incompetence. There's a lot of anger out there, and more people are seeing clearer than ever, but few are taking up the war horn and organizing a pushback. Thing is, their idea of a pushback is to have a bunch of protests. I'm no scholar historian, but I do know that our ancestors never held protests, at least not in the form we hold protests today. The disgruntled peasants never took to the town square to protest their feudal lord, and I'm pretty sure you could guess why. The authorities would simply have them slaughtered en masse for daring to leave their fields unattended, and instead disturbing the peace. The rules of engagement were very clear in those and other eras. What the peasants would do is meet in the forest at night, fashion their farm tools into makeshift weapons, and coordinate an assault upon the Lord's stronghold. It would never occur to these people to hold marches, chant slogans, and hold banners representing various parties to petition their oppressor for to keep a little extra grain each year or for universal suffrage. It's only in the 20th and 21st centuries that we seem to have this misguided notion. Hand in hand with this delusional practice, we have the idea that the masses must wake up and join us in this campaign or demand before anything can be achieved. So we show up week after week, maybe convincing a handful of onlookers to join our cause, yet losing so many more protest members the following week to apathy or burnout. Usually when an issue isn't directly making life a living hell for a Western person on a daily basis, they tend to drop off after the third or fourth protest for one or more reasons. And don't talk to me about the yellow vests. It's no secret that protest and rioting is a French national pastime. The neighbouring European countries the movement did spread to died out rapidly, while the French continued on and on, only to be impeded by the continent-wide lockdown. To use the French, or any other anomalous example, to decide what's possible is just delusional. The point is that in prior eras, when the disgruntled plebs did something, it was a very decisive act, either conducting a direct assault against an institution of power or a strategic act to provoke that power into committing an atrocity. Those familiar with the lore of the Second Russian Revolution will know that a simple protest for food and fuel resulted in a massacre by Russian troops, ultimately making the monarchy universally unpopular and leading to the Bolshevik takeover of the country. If ever a protest achieved anything of actual significance, it was that one, and no protest since has come anywhere near it. Since then, the art of protest has become a Marxist fixation, which has seeped into the consciousness of the general population in the West. In 2020, the majority of us who take up the torch of activism seem to think it's the only way of effecting change in the world. In actual fact, what protest has become is a playpen for the disgruntled pleb to work out his frustrations and feel as though he's achieving something. Not knocking the dedication some people put into attending such events, by the way, as for some reason 99% of protests are held in Dublin, and Ireland has such a shite public transport system that attending such an event from, say, Galway at 2 p.m. often means you only get home by midnight. It's admirable, but it's taking your time, money, and energy, depleting you. But what have you actually achieved? At most, you're just making it harder for TDs and other staff to get to and from work, most of whom might actually agree with your grievances. Those who you protest against, however, may actually psychopathically enjoy the idea of hundreds of people standing outside screaming about them. It's an utterly pointless enterprise. You just pat yourself on the back, go home, and you're less angry. Since Marxism laid this cancerous egg in our minds about 100 years ago, protest has only ever worked a handful of times in an Irish context. The most notable, in my opinion, is the freeing of the Rossport Five in 2005. Not many people remember when the Irish government sold a valuable resource of oil and gas to the Shell Corporation for a wank and a packet of crisps, and insisted that the landowners allow the foreign corporation to build infrastructure through their land to facilitate that theft. If you can imagine, the Irish still had a shred of self-respect back then and took exception to the idea of our national resources being swiped away, and affected landowners didn't feel like permanently sacrificing their land for someone else's profit. As a result, 5 men were arrested for interfering with construction on their own land. Meanwhile, the campaign to keep our national resources was slowly building. What really added fuel to the fire, pun intended, was the court injunction and subsequent imprisonment of these men. A protest was organized for October 1st, 2005, which 10,000 people would ultimately attend, outstripping any previous protest in the history of Ireland, and, as if by magic, Shell filed to remove the injunction on September 30th, immediately resulting in the release of the Rossport Five. The Wikipedia article suggests that Shell filed because of intense media and political scrutiny, but the truth is that our backward media and corrupt politicians wouldn't have said a word about the situation if there wasn't a threat of unrest. In that one case, the threat of 10,000 people on the streets of Dublin scared the establishment into submission. Unless you're hopelessly delusional, you know that this can't be replicated today. Through various factors, people just aren't willing to show up on the streets for any issue or campaign that you can think of. We're also too fractionalized to stand with each other on anything, especially if a campaign is spearheaded by a particular group or party. We're also in the position of the boy who cried wolf after 100+ years of not one single revolution. Maybe even 10,000 people wouldn't budge policy an inch today, because the last time that happened, we retroactively got what we wanted, and 99% of us went home and never protested the issue again. A few days ago, an activist page on Facebook posted a, quote, funny meme, unquote, about how fucked these new government edicts are. I suggested in a comment that people stop talking shite and organize civil disobedience. The responses I got were abysmal. The first being, yeah, like BLM, and the second, from the page itself, giving me a date for a protest. Have we forgotten the power of civil disobedience? Do we even know what that is anymore? These are ridiculous rhetorical questions. Of course we've forgotten, and of course we don't know what it is. Such is our fetishization of protest. One dimwit thinks it's what Black Lives Matter is doing, rioting, destroying monuments, being 21st century iconoclasts. This, coming from the men of a country which is responsible for the word boycott. It's a fucking disgrace. The reality of civil disobedience has been around since humans formed hierarchical structures. The first hunter-gatherer who refused to give the deer liver to the chief so his family wouldn't go hungry was engaging in civil disobedience, so don't get hung up on the name or the writer who coined it. Breaking it down, civil equals non-violent, non-confrontational. Disobedience equals refusal to follow or execute a dictate from an authority. It's an act which requires a spine to be present in the hind area of someone's body and a certain desperation. This meaning it's not going to happen when the good times are going, mainly because almost nobody thinks it's worth their while, and also because nobody will give a shit when they're ultimately arrested and imprisoned. We're now approaching a moment when people will give a shit when you're arrested, especially if it's coordinated and you're not alone. An example of where civil disobedience would have worked was last Sunday at Crow Park, when the Muslim community were allowed to perform their Eid celebration at the hallowed ground. A dozen Catholics, and seemingly no one else, showed up and recited the rosary for at least an hour outside the stadium itself. This was stupid. I'm sorry, but it was. It achieved nothing except attract Antifa and irritate passerbys, because the Irish are about as enthusiastic about Catholicism as they are about Islam. If these fellows had their thinking caps on, they'd have went inside the damn stadium, as supposed Muslims, sat together if possible, and recited the rosary in the stadium at an opportune time, and possibly holding up a banner succinctly pointing out why the current proceedings are a blasphemy and an insult to the Irish people. Instead, that banner was an advertisement for Niall McConnell's money-printing website. There was no law saying you couldn't attend that event, and no law saying you couldn't recite the rosary or hold up a banner at an opportune time in Crow Park. But you very well may have been booted out of the stadium and or arrested and charged. That's called having balls. The Rossport Five conducted civil disobedience. They were protecting their land from the fascist imposition of a foreign multinational corporation. They were arrested and immediately imprisoned. Remember the ending of their story? They spent 3 months in jail and were likely treated like heroes by their fellow inmates. The people of Ireland sat outside their homes, blocking Irish water workers from installing meters. None were arrested in this action, if memory serves. The people of Ireland also stay put within their homes while Gardaí and private security firms try to forcibly evict them from their homes on the whims of the banks. And say what you like about the weird ideas of David Icke. He stood side by side with his fellow ordinary Englishmen in the court for not paying his TV license, and the court of public opinion superseded the actual court, and they walked free of the offence. And speaking of the English and their TV license struggle, their government has decided that most over 75s will no longer get a free TV license, and as I write this, a campaign known as the Silver Voices has rallied thousands to employ, quote, creative but legal ways to complicate and delay payment, to fudge up the bureaucratic works at the BBC. We'll see how this works out over the coming months, but hopes is that the very real anti-license movement rides on its coattails and plainly refuses to pay outright. This is how you create change. The fundamental problem with a protest is that it presupposes a revolution. It's a show of force. It's militant by nature. Before the internet arrived and rendered such estimates moot, it was once said that every person attending a protest represents 1,000 people in the general population. Even before the advent of electronic communication, this wasn't necessarily true. A minority has always been at the root of every revolution, be it the one that ultimately birthed our republic or the one that birthed the United States. Most people weren't actually in agreement with the revolutionaries. They were the ones who simply showed up and took up arms against the government, and the rest of the population followed suit because either they couldn't give a shit or they were scared of the revolutionaries. Even if you wanted a revolution, what are you revolving into? Etymologically, a revolution is to turn around, not by 30 degrees, not by 90 degrees, but 360 degrees. For the slow among us, meaning we end up exactly where we started. 99 times out of 100, revolutions end in dictatorship and mass murder. So you're going to need a system already worked out ahead of time and some meticulous planning so that the wrong people don't seize power in the middle of the chaos and violence. Case in point, the Bolshevik hijacking of the Russian Revolution. Quote by Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. With civil disobedience, you don't have to overthrow anything because we already have a functioning system, just an abused system inhabited by abusers. Even though our republic and that of many countries were founded on socialist values, the true spirit of the West is that of the Enlightenment. It's a creed that we were all brought up with, that liberty is good, that the mind of man is good, that personal property and self-determination are good, because we are all created by the same thing. That no man is truly above another in terms of a predatory-prey dichotomy. This is the baseline of our civilization, which is upheld by the rule of law and due process. Although this is baked into our cultural artifacts and is how most of us have been raised to live our daily lives, we have seemingly forgotten that this is the sole foundation of our civilization. For some reason, people are now convinced that democracy is the highest achievement. But what happens when a people democratically decides to genocide an ethnic group or a class of people? It has a name: democide, death by government. The stable foundation upon which society rests is much more constant and reliable than that. We call that thing liberty. It should not be democratically overridden, yet it often is. This is why, in theory, the courts supersede the parliament. We as men and women, in our short lifespans, can choose to see our liberty and that of our descendants squandered by the crowd, or we can choose to take a stand. Today is a day when that choice is coming to your doorstep. In civil disobedience, you are not attacking the system, but forcing it to change by the demonstration of it not working in your favor. We're too civilly obedient, so that our fellow countrymen and the rest of the world have no idea we're negatively affected by a government decision. How do we know our countrymen feel the same, or that the global community are willing to support us if we don't simply disobey laws or government edicts? Just like the thousands made their way to Dublin to protest imprisonment of the Rossport Five, it's possible that many thousands or millions will flock to support someone disobeying a law or an edict which fundamentally infringes upon their liberty. Today, the most direct and obnoxious threat on your liberty is the edict of wearing masks and not opening your pubs and other businesses. But mostly this mask bullshit. What are you going to do about that? Protest? I.e., beg? I humbly suggest, instead of a day of making yourself feel good on a day out in Dublin, you organise with your friends and fellow activists around Ireland to disobey the edict demanding masks in commercial establishments and public transport. I humbly suggest, instead of making yourself feel good on a day out in Dublin, you organise with your friends and fellow activists around Ireland to disobey the edict demanding masks in commercial establishments and public transport. To this day, there have been business owners in Ireland and America opening their doors to customers only to be hounded by authorities to close very shortly afterwards. Although they were likely confronted by fines and possibly prison terms, their sacrifice was not for naught. On the day the Irish occupational government imposed masks on public transport, a man with disabilities fought with a bus driver and Gardaí over his right to breathe freely and his right to not reveal the nature of his disability under the Data Protection Act. But due to a few understandable missteps by him, he ended up in custody and charged. Yet his sacrifice was not for naught. These people's brave sacrifices emboldened me and informed me that there is a civil way of dealing with the imposition of a corrupt government, and possibly it has done the same for you. These people's sacrifices may yet be for naught if we don't take up the baton. If we succeed in this next step, who knows what's possible? Refusing to pay the TV license? Refusing to pay property tax? The possibilities are endless once we understand our power. UNESCO 2005 Statement on Bioethics and Human Rights, Article 6, Consent, Paragraph 1. Any preventative, diagnostic, or therapeutical medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior, free, and informed consent of the person concerned, based on adequate information. The consent should, where appropriate, be express and may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice.